Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so we're jumping into your stack of sources, listener, really pulling out the essentials.
Yeah, chasing those aha moments.
Exactly, and giving you that shortcut to being, genuinely well-informed.
It's about seeing the whole landscape of the information, right?
Yeah.
Finding the key landmarks in the material you've shared with us.
Absolutely. And today, we are taking a deep dive into a topic that's kind of become part of everyday language, Zen.
Mhm.
But its true depth might be a bit of a mystery. We hear Zen, lowercase z, used to mean like calm or peaceful.
Right, that general vibe.
Yeah. But your sources, they invite us into Zen as, well, a profound spiritual tradition, specifically within Mahayana Buddhism.
Definitely.
So our task today, explore this tradition based entirely on the material you've given us.
That's the plan. And the sources, they really do reveal a much richer, more complex picture than that common perception.
So what is it at its core, according to this material?
Well, at its heart, it's a Mahayana Buddhist school. It started in China.
Yeah.
And it's this fascinating blend, really.
A blend of what?
It takes Indian Mahayana traditions, things like Yogacara and Madhyamaka, which I'm sure we'll get into,
Okay.
and weaves them together with Chinese ideas, particularly Taoism, like Neo-Taoist thought.
Interesting.
And the fundamental emphasis, it's really on meditation practice and gaining direct intuitive insight.
Okay, let's unpack that then, starting right at the beginning. The name itself, Zen, where does that actually come from?
The name. Yeah, the journey of the name is, well, it's pretty illustrative of how the tradition spread. It all starts with the Sanskrit word dhyana.
Dhyana.
Yeah, dhyana. It means something like contemplation or, the state you get through meditation.
Right.
So when this practice and the whole concept traveled to China, that word became Chan.
Okay, Chan. And I'm guessing that's the word that eventually makes its way to Japan and becomes Zen.
You got it, exactly.
Yeah.
So dhyana in Sanskrit, Chan in Chinese, Zen in Japanese.
Huh.
And your sources also point out that in Chinese, there's actually a distinction. There's Chanzo. Yeah, which means the school, the tradition itself. And then there's just Chan, which refers specifically to the practice of meditation.
Ah, okay, that's a helpful clarification.
Yeah.
The sources also mention another Chinese name, Fuxinzheng. What's that about?
Fuxinzheng.
Right.
That translates to the Buddha mind school. And this name is, well, it's incredibly significant
Why is that?
because it directly links the tradition to a really core Mahayana idea. The enlightened mind.
The Buddha's mind.
Not just the historical Buddha's mind, no. It's more, as the sources suggest, the pure, original, awakened mind that's understood to be inherent in, well, all beings.
In everyone. Wow.
Yeah. And it's sometimes connected to Buddhakaya, the Buddha body, which kind of represents enlightened activity in the world.
So the name isn't just about the meditation, but also the goal, or maybe the inherent potential that Buddha mind.
Exactly.
And this whole thing started in China, Tang Dynasty, right? Drawing on those Indian roots, but also Taoism. And the sources mention Bodhidharma. Is he the one credited with bringing it from India?
That's the traditional origin story, yeah. Bodhidharma, bringing dhyana from India. And from China, this tradition just spread remarkably.
Where did it go?
It went south to Vietnam, where it's called Thien,
Mm-hmm.
northeast to Korea, becoming Seon,
Seon.
and of course east to Japan, where it evolved into the Zen we often hear about.
Okay. And you mentioned its central things are meditation and direct insight. What else do the sources highlight as really core to Zen?
Well, beyond the meditation practice itself, the sources really emphasize achieving that direct insight into one's own Buddha nature.
Buddha nature.
Yeah, that's Jianxing in Chinese or Kenshin in Japanese. That insight is like vital.
Okay.
And just as important, it's about then expressing this awakened insight, this wisdom, through your actions in daily life.
Right.
Particularly, for the benefit of other people.
Right. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, based on the material you've given us. There's this image, right, of Zen masters being really unconventional.
Mm-hmm. Iconoclastic sometimes.
Yeah, maybe even iconoclastic, sometimes seeming to, de-emphasize traditional study or practices, all in favor of direct personal experience. often through sitting meditation, zazen, or interacting with the master. The sources definitely mention this style.
Yes, that image is certainly present in some of the narratives, absolutely.
But then the sources immediately seem to balance that. They stress that most Zen schools, most practitioners, also engage in a whole wide range of traditional Buddhist practices.
That's crucial.
Things like chanting, following precepts, walking meditation, rituals, monastic life. And yes, even studying scriptures. It's not nearly as simple as just like throwing out the rule book, is it?
Not at all. That's a really critical nuance the sources underline. Zen is this rich synthesis, and its doctrinal foundation is deep. It draws from a really diverse array of Mahayana sources.
Like what?
Okay, so the sources list things like Sarvastivaya meditation methods, the basic bodhisattva teachings, the philosophy of Yogacara. That's the consciousness-focused one. The idea of the Buddha embryo, or potential, found in Tathagata Garbha texts like the Lokavatara Sutra.
Okay, lots of sutras.
Oh, yeah. Then there's the Hawaiian school's intricate vision of interconnectedness, the wisdom teachings from Prajaparamati literature, and the philosophy of emptiness from Madhyamaka. It pulls from all of these.
Wow, okay. That gives us the historical and doctrinal roots. Let's maybe zero in on some of the really big ideas. You mentioned Buddha nature and innate enlightenment. How do the sources describe this?
Right, this is absolutely a cornerstone of Mahayana Buddhism, and Zen just wholeheartedly embraces it. As the sources explain it, it's this fundamental idea that the potential for awakening, the awakened mind itself, it isn't something external you need to, like, find or build.
It's already there.
It's already fully present, inherent within you, within all sentient beings. Important texts like the Lokavatara Sutra, the Awakening of Faith, and the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment were really pivotal in developing and championing this idea.
So the path isn't about creating Buddhahood, it's about recognizing what's already there.
Precisely. The sources describe this innately awakened mind as the sort of empty source from which all phenomena arise.
Okay, so what does this mean for practice then?
Well, the Zen path, as it's laid out in this material you gave us, is fundamentally about realizing or recognizing this inherent enlightenment within yourself.
That recognition is the insight.
That recognition is that key insight, yes. Yakshing or Kensho. The Platform Sutra, which the sources identify as a really seminal Zen text, made this concept of original inherent enlightenment absolutely central. It's the basis for calling it the Buddha mind school. There's a quote from Zonmi, a key figure, emphasizing this intrinsically enlightened true mind, describing it as clear and bright, ever-present awareness.
That makes a lot of sense. The goal is realizing the Buddha you already are.
Okay.
But if that's kind of the positive side, the sources also talk quite a bit about emptiness cum and a kind of negative language, drawing on Madhyamaka. How does that fit in?
Ah, yes, that's where the crucial balance comes in. Because while Zen affirms this inherent Buddha nature, it also strongly emphasizes emptiness and non-conceptual wisdom, a state often called no mind, Wuxin.
No mind.
Yeah. And the sources highlight that Zen masters frequently use apophatic language, language that negates or denies things.
Why do they do that?
Specifically to prevent practitioners from fixating or clinging to any concept, even positive ones like Buddha nature or enlightenment.
Okay.
This is really rooted in that Mahayana understanding, heavily influenced by Madhyamaka, that all things, all phenomena, like a fixed, independent essence, svabhava.
So it sounds like they're using language to kind of break down our reliance on language and concepts themselves.
Exactly that. They employ this sort of negative dialectic, showing that all concepts are just relative constructs. They have to be ultimately transcended to grasp the direct truth.
Is there an example?
Yeah, the sources use the classic example of the word mu.
Mu.
Wu in Chinese, meaning no or not. It's the famous answer Master Zhaozu gave in that kun about whether a dog has Buddha nature.
Right, I've heard of that.
It's not just a simple no answer, though. It's meant to be a sound, a word, intended to just shatter conceptual thinking. And that state of no mind, Wuxin, it's described as this meditative clarity, free from grasping, free from the limits of concepts, directly connected to wisdom and, ultimate reality.
It's fascinating how these two, seemingly opposite ideas, inherent potential and the emptiness of everything, including that potential, are held together.
The sources also discuss non-duality, buer or funi.
Non-duality, yeah, another key theme the sources explore. They describe it in several ways, actually.
Such as?
Well, one is the unity, the inseparability of ultimate truth and relative truth, basically the two truths doctrine. You find that in influential texts like the Five Ranks, the Faith and Mind, the Vimalakirti Sutra.
So, not seeing conventional reality and ultimate reality as totally separate things? Correct, exactly. Another aspect is the non-duality of subject and object, which stems more from Yogacara philosophy. The idea that the perceiver and the perceived aren't fundamentally distinct or separate entities.
Okay.
And the sources also mention the influence of the Hawaiian school's concept of perfect interfusion, yu and rong.
Perfect interfusion.
Yeah, where principle, lead insigli, and phenomena completely interpenetrate. You see this reflected in teachings like Dongshan's 5 ranks. Basically, everything is interconnected, non-dual.
And bringing these ideas together, then, we get to the concept of sudden enlightenment, or seeing one's nature, Jansen Kenshi.
Yes, exactly. Affirming inherent Buddha nature naturally leads to this focus. Seeing one's nature refers to that direct, often described as sudden penetration into understanding or realizing that originally enlightened mind.
The classic phrase.
According to the sources, it's seeing one's nature, becoming Buddha.
Is this realization always sudden, though? Because the sources seem to hint there's been, well, nuance and maybe debate within Zen itself on this.
That's a really important clarification the sources make. Yes. While some early narratives strongly emphasize sudden awakening, there were disagreements even early on about how this insight is achieved.
Like what kind of disagreements?
For instance, debates about different methods.
Yeah.
Like contemplating a huatu versus just sitting in silent illumination.
Ah.
And there was also discussion about how cultivation or practice fits in after a moment of insight. Does anything need to happen then?
Right.
So the sources note that a kind of sudden gradual schema became quite standard later on, particularly from the time of Zongmi.
Sudden gradual.
Yeah, the view suggests an initial sudden insight might be followed by a period of gradual cultivation to deepen and stabilize that understanding, integrate it into everyday life. This is illustrated in texts like the famous 10 ox herding pictures.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not always just a simple switch being flipped. The sources show it's definitely more complex than that.
Okay, that gives us a pretty good handle on the core concepts. Let's maybe shift gears now to practice. When most people think of Zen practice, they probably think of sitting meditation, right? Zazen.
Absolutely.
The sources confirm this is central.
Oh, absolutely central. Meditation Chan in Chinese, Dhyana in Sanskrit is fundamental. And seated meditation Zuosan in Chinese, Zazen in Japanese, is definitely its most recognizable form.
And where does this come from?
The sources trace this practice directly back to the Indian Dhyana Sutras that arrived in China. They mention influential early texts like the Anban Shui Jing, Zuchan Sanmei Jing, and the Dhamma Juolu Jing.
And these early Indian texts, they describe specific techniques, right? Not just sitting quietly.
Correct. The sources actually list methods from these classic Dhyana Sutras. Things like mindfulness of breathing, contemplating the body's impurities, cultivating loving kindness, analyzing dependent origination, contemplating the Buddha.
Wow.
These are described as the 5 methods for stilling or pacifying the mind. They're designed to focus and settle mental activity, to facilitate deeper meditative states, or dhyana.
Anything else?
The sources also mention other classic practices being part of this early tradition that influenced Chan, like the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 3 gates of liberation.
But then the sources talk about a more specific Chan approach, sometimes even seeming to, downplay those traditional methods. How is that described?
Right. This reflects how Chan evolved in China, and that strong emphasis on direct insight. Some early Chan texts described a kind of unique method, using terms like maintaining mind, viewing mind, or pacifying the mind.
Framing it as more direct.
Sometimes framing it as a more direct path, compared to the detailed step-by-step methods in the earlier Dhyana Sutras. That famous phrase, Chan points directly to the human mind, really captures this emphasis on direct access.
But going back to that balance point we keep hitting, the sources also note the importance of concepts like no mind, Wuxin, and even no mindfulness, Wunyan here.
Yeah. Yes. That's the necessary counterbalance, definitely influenced by Madhyamaka. The sources emphasize that this focus on, say, viewing mind had to be understood within the context of emptiness and no clinging. Otherwise, it could just lead to attachment to a concept of mind itself. Texts like the treatise on no mind and the Platform Sutra were crucial here, articulating this balance, the importance of direct seeing, but without getting conceptually fixated.
Okay. And this leads to some, pretty surprising findings in the sources that some Zen texts and masters actually seem to de-emphasize even seated meditation or maybe effort in general.
This is particularly highlighted, when discussing certain figures in text, especially in the Linji and Hongbo lineages. The sources point out this kind of iconoclastic strand which stressed engaging fully in just ordinary, everyday activities.
As the practice.
As the site of practice, yes. cultivating a state of having nothing to do wuxi.
Nothing to do, like laziness.
No, not laziness. More like a radical letting go of contrived effort. Early texts, like the Long Scroll and the Platform Sutra, are cited as actually questioning the overemphasis on fixed methods like mindfulness or concentration.
Why?
Suggesting that insight is ultimately sudden and doesn't really depend on accumulating gradual effort in that conventional way.
And this unconventional approach, this is where we get those really well-known, often provocative examples from the sources, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Phrases like that quote from the Record of the Dharma Jewel saying it's better destroy ethics than true seeing.
Wow.
Or the Bloodstream Sermon's assertion that karma doesn't truly affect someone who's realized their true nature. There's the rejection of clinging to religious forms captured by those who hold on to appearances are devils.
And the really famous
And the most famous example, from the Record of Linji. If you meet a Buddha, kill the Buddha.
Which, I mean, the sources make clear, isn't advocating actual violence, right? It's a metaphor.
Absolutely. It's intended as rhetorical shock, designed to break our deepest attachments, even attachments to the highest spiritual figures or concepts, as a means to complete emancipation, getting free from entanglement.
Okay.
It's part of that iconoclastic style found in certain lineages, especially prominent in the Song Dynasty narratives. But as we've seen, alongside these really radical expressions, the sources also detail specific, formalized meditation techniques used across various schools.
Right. Okay. Like silent illumination.
Yes, exactly. Known as mozal in Chinese, or mokushu in Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
This practice was central to the Caodong school, strongly associated with Master Hongzhi Zhengzhu.
And how do the sources describe it?
They describe it as a unified practice, drawing from those classic Indian Buddhist concepts of shamatha, calm abiding, and vipayana insight, kind of doing both at once.
And in the Japanese Soto school, there's a practice that's often compared to it, right?
That's shikantaza, which translates pretty simply to just sitting.
Just sitting.
Yeah. It was strongly emphasized by Dogen, the founder of Japanese Soto. The sources explain his description using the term hishiri.
Hishiri.
Yeah, it's hard to translate. Something like non-thinking or beyond thinking, a state of pure awareness that transcends both thinking and not thinking. The mind is described as being like nowhere and everywhere.
So similar to silent illumination, but distinct.
Similar, yeah, but the sources note they're distinct approaches within different lineages.
Okay. Then there's the practice specifically associated with the Linji school in China and Rinzai in Japan. Kunin contemplation.
Right. Kanhua-chan, or observing the phrase, meditation. This became a really prominent method during the Song Dynasty in China, particularly championed by masters like Dahui Zonggao.
And Dahu was critical of silent illumination.
He was, yes, notably critical, although the sources do say even Dahui sometimes recommended quiet sitting. But Kunin practice involves contemplating a critical phrase, the huatu, drawn from a kunin.
A kunin being like a paradoxical story or question.
Exactly. A story, dialogue, or question involving past masters. This approach is still widely used in Chinese and Korean Zen traditions today.
And Japanese Rinzai took the kan system and formalized it even more.
Yes, according to the sources, Japanese Rinzai developed this highly structured kan curriculum. It involves private interviews, dakusan, with a master.
Dakusan.
Yeah, where the practitioner presents their understanding. And there are, like, standardized answers, checking questions called sasho, and capping phrases, jakugo.
Wow, very structured.
Very. The aim is to break down conceptual thought and arrive at a direct, non-conceptual insight, to essentially become one with the kan itself.
And interaction with the master is key.
Crucial, absolutely crucial in this process. But the sources also include a kind of cautionary note here, that this kind of intense personal interaction is potentially vulnerable to misuse.
Ah, that makes sense. Okay. And alongside these specific forms of meditation, the sources mention Nyanfo Chan.
Yes, Nyanfo Chan. This involves reciting the Buddha's name, typically Amitabha Buddha. It's a practice most associated with Pure Land Buddhism.
But it's used in Zen, too.
Yes. The sources show it was integrated into Chan and Zen very early on in China, practiced by significant early masters like Daxin and Xingxiu, and included in early monastic codes. It continued through figures like Yongming, Yanshu, Hanshan Deking. It's a major practice in Japanese Bakuzen and Vietnamese Hien as well, often linked to the idea that one's own mind is the Pure Land.
So practice in Zen is clearly much, much broader than just sitting meditation or kushan work. What other practices do the sources list?
Oh, quite a few. Well, first, since Zen is fundamentally a Mahayana tradition, the path is grounded in the Bodhisattva ideal,
Helping all beings.
dedicating oneself to the liberation of all beings, yeah. So the sources mention the six paramitas, the perfections, generosity, ethics, patience, energy, meditation, wisdom, and the Bodhisattva vows as core aspects. Drawing influence from texts like the Avatamsaka Sutra, these are seen as essential gradual cultivations.
Okay. Fasting is also mentioned.
Yes, zai, meaning fasting or observing dietary restrictions. Practiced on certain days, zairi. And the sources mention examples of extended fasts undertaken for spiritual merit, citing figures like Suan Hua.
And monasticism itself is the traditional bedrock.
Right. Absolutely. Zen primarily developed and was transmitted within monastic institutions with ordained monastics. The sources point out some distinct features of East Asian monasticism compared to, say, the traditional Indian models.
Like
A stronger emphasis on self-sufficiency, including storing and cooking food, sometimes even farming, rather than relying solely on begging rounds.
interesting difference. There are also elements like chanting and rituals.
Definitely. Monasteries and centers regularly perform various ceremonies and services that involve chanting.
What kind of chanting?
Chanting verses, poems, important sutras like the Heart Sutra or Chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra.
Oh.
Also Tarans, which are like longer mantras. The sources mention practices like repentance rituals, chan or zaing, rites for local deities in Japan, observing holidays. Even specific ceremonies like Mizuko Kuyu for miscarriages are part of the practice landscape described.
And something else that might surprise people's, typical image of Zen, esoteric practices. Mantras and dharans seem to show up here.
Yeah, the sources are quite explicit about the historical presence of esoteric elements within Chan and Zen.
Really?
Oh yeah, using mantras and dharans for various purposes, focusing the mind, protection, invoking the power of bodhisattvas like Guanyin. It's traced back to the Tang dynasty in Chinese Chan.
What influenced that?
Influence from the Zhenyan, or esoteric school. Evidence is found in historical records, Dunhuang manuscripts, even linked to practices among Shaolin monks. And these esoteric elements continue in various modern rituals like the Yuji Yanku or Shuilu Fahui ceremonies.
This isn't just limited to China, it seems.
No, it's spread. Japanese Zen includes what's sometimes called mixed Zen, Kenshi Zen, which deliberately incorporates esoteric Buddhist rites. Figures like Kaizan Jukin, a Soto master, were influenced by Shingon and Shugendo practices.
Rinzai, too.
Early Rinzai figures like Aizai and Eni Benen also integrated esoteric elements. And Korean Seon historically also showed inclusivity of esoteric Buddhist lore and rituals, for example, in the writings of Master Hyujong.
Wow. Okay, and finally, the sources mentioned physical cultivation.
Right, another aspect that really broadens the picture of Zen practice. The sources discuss Shaolin practices known as martial Shan Wukan.
Kung Fu monks.
Well, it developed from the 12th century onwards as a form of inner cultivation, blending Buddhist principles with Taoist physical exercises like Daiyan and Kugan, aimed at promoting health, longevity, nourishing life, and supporting spiritual liberation.
Not just fighting.
Not just fighting, no.
Yeah.
The sources also mention Korean Sammudo and the historical contact between Japanese Zen and Buja martial arts, noting figures like Takwin Sush, who wrote on the connection between Zen and martial training.
Then Hakun.
Hakunikaku, yeah, a major figure in Japanese Rinzai, also introduced energetic Naiken practices. Influenced by Taoism, focusing the flow of qi on the lower abdomen, the tendon. It's about harmonizing body and mind as part of the spiritual path.
Wow, that really, really expands the definition of Zen practice far beyond just sitting on a cushion. Okay, let's quickly look at the history and how these traditions developed based on your sources.
Sure. The sources conveniently outline the historical development in China through several phases. You've got Proto-Chan, with early figures like Bodhidharma, focusing mainly on meditation.
Okay.
Then Early Chan, associated with the East Mountain School, masters like Honggren, Shenziyu, Huineng. This saw the development of distinct lineages, including that famous, though maybe historically complex, northern-southern split. Middle Chan saw the rise of hugely influential schools like Hangzhou under Ma Zudai, known for its more unconventional style, and the development of the first monastic codes. This period also had more intellectually oriented schools like Heze under Zongmi, And importantly, Chan survived a major anti-Buddhist persecution.
Then the Song Dynasty.
The Song Dynasty, yeah. Often described as a golden age narrative period in the sources. Chan became the dominant force in Chinese Buddhism, got state support, saw the big rivalry between Linji and Caodong schools, and the compilation of those influential Ken collections.
And what about after that Song Dynasty Golden Age narrative?
The sources cover the post-classical and modern eras too. These periods are characterized by increasing syncretism, especially integrating Pure Land practice, that Nyanfuk Chan we mentioned.
Okay.
Also a renewed emphasis on scriptural study, which had been somewhat downplayed rhetorically earlier. And in the modern era, the rise of humanistic Buddhism, focusing more on social activism and modern scholarship.
And from China, as you said, Zen spread out.
Yes, firmly establishing itself in Vietnam, Thien, Korea, Seon, and Japan. Zen, where the main surviving schools today are Soko, Rinzai, and Chubaku.
And then to the west.
And the sources also cover the transmission to the west, mostly in the 20th century, mentioning key figures like D.T. Suzuki, Shunryu Suzuki, Kiknot Han, and various authors who really played a role in popularizing it globally.
So it's really clear from the sources there isn't just one single unified Zen.
Not at all. The sources explicitly highlight the diversity. They list various schools and traditions, historically and today, including the main Chinese lineages, Caodong, Linji, the major Japanese schools, the Soto, Rinzai, Shibaku, other lineages like Fuke.
And modern groups.
And more modern, often transnational groups like Sanbo, Kyodan, the Truklam tradition from Vietnam, Plum Village, the Quan School of Zen. Each has its own unique history, practices, emphasis. It's a wide spectrum.
Okay.
Let's talk about the structure of these traditions. How is teaching authority passed down? The sources discuss Dharma transmission, Chuanfin. All right, Dharma transmission. This is a really central concept in Zen for passing on the lineage. According to the sources, it's seen as both a formal recognition in Ezka of a student's deep realization and an institutional procedure for ensuring the continuity of a particular temple or lineage.
So it connects the teacher back.
Exactly. It's how a teacher is formally linked back through a chain of masters, traditionally going all the way back to the Buddha and the early patriarchs, sometimes described metaphorically as a mind-to-mind transmission.
The sources suggest this emphasis on lineage might have been influenced by Confucian values. Is that right?
That's an interesting point they raise, yeah. Scholars, according to the sources, suggest that the strong ancestral dimension in Zen, seeing the lineage almost like this extended spiritual family tree, might be influenced by Confucian social values, the importance of lineage, which could have helped Zen integrate so deeply into East Asian culture.
And legitimacy comes from lineage charts.
Legitimacy is supported by these lineage charts, yeah, and by texts like the transmission of the lamp histories. But and the sources are quite critical here. They point out these texts can be biased, sectarian even. And the narratives often contain mythological material, meaning they aren't always strictly historically accurate records.
Okay. This emphasis on formal lineage and transmission seems so critical, but then the sources also highlight historical critiques of this very system. And that's fascinating.
It really is, isn't it? The sources explicitly note that the institution of formal Dharma transmission has been challenged, criticized throughout Zen's history.
By who?
Well, masters like Linji himself, surprisingly, is presented in some sources as criticizing the process. And the unconventional Japanese master Ikkyu famously rejected formal certificates, viewing the system as having become corrupt or just overly institutionalized.
And this critique of formal transmission, it pops up in other periods too.
Yes, absolutely. The sources mention Ming Dynasty masters in China, like Hanshan Deking. He strongly emphasized self-cultivation and direct insight over formal lineage authentication, acquiring what was termed wisdom without teachers, Wushizi.
Wisdom without teachers.
Yeah. Hanshan specifically questioned the validity and value of formal transmission. And in medieval Japan, figures like Takuan Susho also kind of eschewed formal transmission, believing the Dharma was universally accessible, didn't need a specific institutional stamp.
So some were considered self-taught.
Some masters in this period were considered self-enlightened and self-certified, Jigo-jishu, achieving wisdom without a teacher, Ushidokugo. The sources even note modern Chinese Buddhists criticizing the system as a potentially sectarian Chinese invention, arguing the Dharma itself can't be transmitted like some object.
Wow, that definitely adds a complex layer to the whole idea of lineage. Okay, let's move to the role of scripture in Zen. There's that famous saying, right? Not established on words.
Ah, yes, that saying. Very well known, often cited as like a core principle. Suggests Zen is this direct, wordless transmission.
But
The sources provide a much more nuanced picture. They strongly emphasize that Zen is deeply rooted in Mahayana Buddhist teachings and texts.
So texts are important.
Very. Classic Zen texts frequently reference numerous sutras. Historically, ordained monastics were certainly expected to be knowledgeable about the Zen canon. The sources state early Chan authors were clearly very well read in a wide range of sutras in Mahayana philosophy.
So that idea of being outside scriptures, that came later, maybe?
According to the sources, yes. That phrase and the whole associated narrative special transmission outside scriptures not established on words or letters seems to have gained prominence later. During the late Tang and Song dynasties, who
Championed it.
particularly championed by the Hongzhou school under Mazu. It resonated with the educated literati class, who were attracted to the idea of enlightened sages who didn't rely on textual learning in a conventional scholarly way.
And the iconoclastic examples.
Those iconoclastic examples we discussed earlier, Linji calling scriptures toilet paper, or Deshan burning commentaries, they're cited as part of this rhetoric. Powerful, maybe, but perhaps not the whole story.
And the sources clarify this wasn't a total rejection of scripture.
Crucially, no. The sources clarify these statements were intended more as a cautionary warning against clinging to the words or concepts in scriptures as an end in themselves, mistaking the map for the territory, not a wholesale denial of the value of the texts.
Masters still use sutras.
Masters continue to cite and draw upon sutras. The sources contrast this rhetorical Chan style, which de-emphasized conventional study, with literary Chan, associated with figures like Zongmi or Yangming Yanshu. These masters promoted scriptural study alongside practice, arguing for the correspondence of the teachings in Chan that Chan insights were consistent with the scriptures when properly understood.
Zongmi saw scriptures almost like a test of one's insight, a standard.
Yes, exactly. The sources quote Zongmi, stating that scriptures serve as a standard to determine true and false, meaning they could help validate whether one's insight was authentic, not just some delusion. And Hakuin, the prominent Japanese Rinzai master, also emphasized this balance, saying the path begins with studying sutras.
So the modern understanding supported by the sources is that study and practice are complementary, not opposed.
Exactly. While ultimate insight is non-conceptual, the intellectual understanding you gain from studying the teachings supports and informs practice. The sources describe it as needing two swords, the study of the teachings, kyoso, and the direct experience of the way, doriki.
Both are needed.
Both. They state Zen requires intellectual understanding and literary study. These two aspects are in a complementary both-hand relationship, not an either-or.
Okay. And Zen drew from a vast library of scriptures, right? Not just one central text.
That's correct. Zen didn't really form around a single foundational sutra like some other schools did. Instead, it drew deeply from and was influenced by a wide array of Mahayana scriptures.
Which ones were key?
The sources highlight texts like the Shimaladeva Sutra, the Awakening of Faith, the Lokavatakara Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and of course the Platform Sutra is particularly important.
Oh, there's two.
Oh, yeah. Other influential ones mentioned include the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Abhitamsaka Sutra, especially for interconnectedness, and the Bodhisattva Path, the Shurangama Sutra, and the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. The sources also note the influence of certain Chinese apocryphal or self-authored sutras, like the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment.
And Zen also developed its own unique body of literature over time, didn't it?
It created a remarkably rich and diverse literary tradition, yes. The sources list various genres that became important. Things like texts, sometimes treated like sutras, such as the Platform Sutra itself.
What else?
Philosophical poems, like The Faith in Mind. Extensive transmission records and dialogues between masters, the transmission of the lamp, anthology of the Patriarchal Hall, recorded sayings of prominent masters, like the record of Linji, those influential cone collections like the Gateless Barrier and the Blue Cliff record, and practical meditation manuals like the Zushan Yi. Quite a library.
Okay, wow. We've covered the philosophy, the practices, the historical spread, the structure, the relationship with scripture. Let's just briefly touch on the narratives, the sort of stories that have shaped how Zen is understood.
Right, the narratives. The sources discuss the traditional Zen narrative, the Tizien, which was significantly shaped by texts written during China's Song dynasty.
And this narrative portrayed Tang masters in a certain way.
Yes, it often presented this idealized view of Tang dynasty Chan, portraying the masters as deliberately unconventional, iconoclastic, using shouts, blows, seemingly irrational behavior to shock students into awakening.
But the sources you provided, they call these stories apocryphal lore.
They do. The sources are pretty clear that many of these dramatic, iconoclastic anecdotes, the ones that became central to the song narrative, more popularized later, aren't actually found in the earlier contemporary Tang Dynasty sources.
Wow, they developed later.
They seem to have developed later, yeah. Perhaps reflecting the style and concerns of the song period, masters and compilers themselves. This narrative became very influential, partly because Chan gained significant state support during the song.
And the lineage narrative is part of this historical storytelling.
Yes, the idea of an unbroken spiritual lineage, tracing directly from the historical Buddha down to contemporary teachers. That's a key part of the traditional narrative, supported by those lineage charts in historical texts.
But as you noted, maybe not always historically precise.
Exactly. As the sources noted earlier when discussing transmission, these charts and histories can sometimes be inaccurate or contain mythological elements, often introduced to legitimize particular schools or masters.
Modern scholarship has clearly played a role in giving us a more complex view, hasn't it?
It really has, particularly since the 1970s. Critical academic research has significantly challenged that idealized traditional Zen narrative. It's revealed the complexity, the diversity, sometimes the messy reality of Zen history, moving beyond the often romanticized image popularized in the West, partly through earlier interpretations.
And scholars approach this in different ways.
Yeah, the sources mention different ways scholars approach Zen history, looking at the TZN itself as a historical phenomenon, analyzing it through the lens of Buddhist modernism, or using historical and cultural criticism. They also note external interpretations like non-dualism, engaging with Zen ideas.
Well, we've certainly taken a pretty comprehensive journey through Zen today, guided by the sources you curated for us, listener.
It's been a deep dive indeed. I mean, from understanding its origins as this unique blend of Indian Mahayana and Chinese thought, through the core concepts like inherent Buddha nature balanced by emptiness, exploring that incredibly wide spectrum of practices that go far beyond just sitting.
Yeah, rituals, physical disciplines, even esoteric elements.
Right. Examining its historical evolution, its global spread, the nuances of its institutional structure, and those debates around transmission, and its complex yet profound relationship with Scripture.
It's truly remarkable the depth and variety contained within what we commonly just call Zen, all drawn just from this one body of material you provided.
It really shows that moving beyond the surface-level notions and actually exploring the sources gives you a much richer, more accurate, and honestly, more fascinating picture.
Absolutely. And as we finish up this deep dive, here is a provocative thought for you, listener, to maybe sit with based on the insights from the sources we've discussed.
Okay.
Given those historical critiques of formal Dharma transmission that we talked about, and the examples noted in the sources of masters who were recognized as achieving wisdom without teachers, like those in the Ming Dynasty or medieval Japan, how does that historical perspective challenge or maybe inform our modern understanding of what constitutes legitimate spiritual authority or accomplishment in Zen or maybe in any spiritual path?
That's a big question.
It is. Is legitimacy primarily about formal institutional lineage? Or is it rooted more in direct personal insight and cultivation? Or perhaps it's some dynamic interplay of both. It's a complex question the sources really invite us to ponder.
A very worthy contemplation.
Indeed. Well, thank you for sharing these sources and taking this deep dive with us today.
My pleasure.
We look forward to our next exploration together.
Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture the Viking Age, you probably imagine long ships, right? Cutting through icy seas, warriors.
Yeah, battles, maybe those big explorations to distant lands. That's the classic image.
Exactly. But there's this other legacy, maybe even, I don't know, more incredible, especially from Iceland. Their stories, these really detailed, complex prose narratives, we call them the sagas.
And they give us this window, it's unlike anything else really into that society. They go way beyond just the action stuff. You get a look at their values, their social structures, the history they chose to record, and how they chose to record it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We've got this source material, this Wikipedia article that kind of lays it all out. And our mission really is to get a quick but thorough understanding of what these Norse sagas actually are.
Where they came from.
Where they came from, what kind of, wild stories they contain, And the question that really grabbed me from this source, why? Why did a place like medieval Iceland produce such an astonishing amount of literature?
It's a fascinating puzzle. It really is. And there are some, well, surprising answers tucked away in the source material.
Absolutely. So consider this your deep dive. We're going to walk you through this source, pull out the most compelling bits, and hopefully help you get a real handle on this subject. Let's jump in.
Okay, so basics first. What is a saga? The source defines them as prose stories and histories, composed mostly in medieval Iceland.
Right.
And crucially, they weren't written in Latin, the formal language for scholarship and history pretty much everywhere else in Europe back then.
Ah.
They used Old Norse, the everyday language, the vernacular.
Using their own language.
No.
That feels really significant, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the source says these stories started in the Middle Ages, composed over centuries.
Yeah.
The word saga itself is kind of cool. It comes straight from the Old Norse word for, like, what is said, or utterance narrative.
That's right. It's related to our English word say.
Huh.
And scholars back in the 18th century, they actually borrowed the term saga specifically for these Norse narratives.
Which is why we have the word today. And it's interesting how it's broadened out now, isn't it? Like, we use saga for any big multi-generational novel or, those sprawling fantasy series.
It really has, though in modern Scandinavian languages, the word still basically means history or tale, story. Like, the source mentions Swedish folk saga for a folk or fairy tale.
Oh, right.
Or sagokung for those sort of semi-legendary kings you only know about from old stories. Well, old sagas, essentially.
That right there hints at the blurred lines, doesn't it? History, legend, which seems so central to the sagas. But okay, moving beyond the definition, the source really stresses that saga isn't just one thing. It breaks down into this, fascinating array of different genres.
Oh, absolutely. The subject matter is incredibly diverse. First up, the source mentions the king's sagas, Konungasögur.
Okay.
These focus pretty obviously on the lives of Scandinavian kings, mostly written between the 12th and 14th centuries.
And Heimskringla, that's the famous one, right? Attributed to Snorri Sturluson.
That's the key example given, yeah. And the source points out they often quote skaldic verse, that really complex, intricate praise poetry.
The stuff composed by court poets.
Yeah.
Got it.
So building on that, we get to maybe the most famous sagas today. The sagas of Icelanders. Íslendingasögur, often called family sagas.
Right, the family sagas. I've heard that term.
And these supposedly tell stories of real events from Iceland's settlement period, starting around, say, 870 AD up to about 1030 AD, the Saga Age, they call it.
The source highlights their style too remarkably realistic, it says. Feels different from, I don't know, heroic epics or something.
Very different. And it notes that these probably started as oral stories, told and retold before being written down later, mostly 13th to 15th centuries. And they were influenced by both those oral traditions and whatever literary styles were current then.
It's fascinating how they track families, feuds, generations of people. You get these powerful chieftains and warriors like Egil Skallagrimsson.
Yeah, larger-than-life figures.
But also ordinary farmers, women, the whole spectrum. The source says many scholars think these are the absolute best of the saga writing.
They're often considered the highest quality, yeah. And while they're set mostly in Iceland, the characters travel. The source specifically mentions accounts of journeys to North America, Vinland, places like that.
And it says those voyages were only actually authenticated by archaeology, like in the early 20th century? That's incredible.
It really makes you think about that line between history and literature, doesn't it? Famous examples you might know are Njal Saga, Stella Saga, Eagle Saga. And like the King sagas, these often weave in that skaldic verse. Oh, and the source also mentions shorter tales, stattir, similar material but shorter, often found tucked inside the King sagas.
Okay, so we've got kings, Icelandic families. What about stories about things happening closer to when they were actually writing them?
Good question. That brings us to the contemporary sagas, Samtíðarsögur. These deal with events in 12th and 13th century Iceland, and crucially, they were written pretty soon after the events happened.
Ah, okay.
Most are preserved in a big collection called Sturlunga Saga.
And the article makes a really interesting point about these.
Yeah.
Because they were written about recent stuff for people who probably lived through it or knew the players involved.
Yeah.
The authors couldn't just make things up wholesale. People would know. So they're generally seen as pretty reliable historical sources, relatively speaking.
That's the argument, yeah. The audience provides a kind of fact check, and yes, these also quote skaldic verse.
Okay, so then shifting gears quite a bit.
Right, into a totally different realm. The legendary sagas for Naldursigur, these mixed remote history like stuff happening on the continent before Iceland was even settled with myth, legend, fantasy, really.
So more about entertainment, a heroic, maybe fantastical pagan past.
Seems like it, yeah. Entertainment portraying this adventurous, heroic past. And the source makes a neat distinction. These often quote Edaic verse.
Idaic, like the mythological poems, poetic Edda stuff, not the skaldic court poetry.
Exactly. Different kind of verse for a different kind of story. And there's some overlap mentioned with the next category.
Which is
The chivalric sagas, Riddarrasögur. These are basically translations of continental romances, knights, ladies, adventures, often from Latin or French. Or they're original Icelandic stories written in that same romantic style.
translation started early, 13th century, but they kept writing original ones much later.
Yeah, Icelandic compositions peaked later, 14th century, but amazingly, the source says this genre continued right into the 19th century.
Wow, that's some staying power. And the source notes a difference here with poetry.
Right. These rarely quote verse, and when they do, it's often weird stuff, like a refrain from a dance song, or maybe a riddle woven into the story. Very different from the skaldic or Edaic poems.
Interesting. And finally,
Rounding out the picture, we have the Saints and Bishops sagas. Heilagramannasogur and Biskupasögur. Basically, religious biographies written in the vernacular. Lives of saints, lives of bishops, started mid-12th century, adopting that general saga prose style.
okay, wow. So looking at that whole list,
Right.
it's clear sagas are way more than just Viking adventure tales. You've got history, family drama, myth, romance, religious lives, an enormous range.
Absolutely. That diversity is what makes them such a treasure trove, which, brings us to how they were actually put together. There's this long-running debate. Were they just oral stories finally written down, preserved perfectly, or were they like conscious works of art by individual authors?
What does the source say about that now?
Well, the modern view, as presented here, is more nuanced. It's seen as a blend. Authors were almost certainly drawing on oral traditions, stories they'd heard, but also on existing written stuff, and they were shaping it artistically.
Right, like conscious creation, not just dictation.
Exactly. And you see hints of that artistry in little details the source points out, like how authors sometimes describe clothing from their own time, the 12th century maybe, even when they're writing about events supposedly from the 10th century saga age. It suggests they're trying to create a historical feel, an effect, even if the details aren't perfectly accurate for the period they're depicting.
That really highlights the artistic part, doesn't it? So the source says most sagas were written down roughly between 1190 and 1320. Some based on old traditions, some maybe pure fiction.
Right, and some had known contemporary sources, like the author of King Sverrir's saga supposedly met the king himself.
Wow. And while most are anonymous.
Most are, yeah. But the source mentions an exception. The 14th century North Icelandic Benedictine school. There, you actually have identifiable authors and a kind of distinct, more formal style. Shows regional differences, too.
And it wasn't only Iceland, right? The
Vast majority Icelandic, yes. But Tjörik's saga was composed in Norway, and there was a later one, Hilmarsvakammer's saga, which turned out to be a Swedish forgery. And like we said with the chivalric sagas, some genres kept going for centuries, even into the 19th.
So, okay. We have this incredible flood of diverse literature, mostly from medieval Iceland, over hundreds of years. Which brings us back to that big question from the start. Why? Why did this relatively small, kind of isolated island produce so much sophisticated writing?
This is where the source gets really fascinating, I think, because historians and scholars have puzzled over this for ages. The source mentions some older theories that are mostly, discredited now.
Like what?
Things like nationalist ideas about inherent ethnic traits, or just the simple idea that settlers had to write down their history. The source specifically points out that historian Gunnar Carlson disagrees with that last one. Other settler societies just didn't produce anything like this volume.
Okay, so those are out. What about practical reasons?
Well, there were some pragmatic suggestions, like Iceland had a lot of cattle farming, right? So when they culled animals before winter, there was a steady supply of hides, parchment.
Ah, the raw materials were there.
And then there were those famously long, dark Icelandic winters. Plenty of time for indoor activities like, writing and storytelling.
Consent could be factors. But the source suggests the real key, the more recent and prominent theories, have to do with Iceland's unique social and political setup. This is where it gets juicy.
What seems really striking, based on the source, is the link between the sagas and the political system, the Icelandic Commonwealth. This society didn't have a king, right? No single strong central government enforcing laws. It was decentralized.
Okay, so how does that lead to writing sagas?
Well, the theory, pushed by scholars like Gunnar Carlson and Jesse Byock, mentioned in the source, is that this created unique incentives for the leaders, the aristocrats, the chieftains. They might have used sagas as, like, tools
Tools for what?
for social and political stuff. Think about it. In a place without formal courts enforcing everything, how do you establish norms? How do you settle disputes or argue your case? By documenting past conflicts, feuds, legal fights, how they got resolved or didn't. You're essentially creating the shared body of precedent, of social rules.
Ah, like case law, almost, but in story form.
Sort of. Sagas could build reputations, justify land claims, model good or bad behavior. And because Iceland was on the edge of Europe, no king nearby could just ban writings that might be critical or politically tricky.
So the sagas weren't just entertainment. They could be social glue, maybe even political weapons in this unique stateless society. The source also mentions this idea about new versus old power groups.
Yeah, that leaders in newer factions might have used sagas to build solidarity, create a shared identity. Look at our heroic ancestors. Whereas older, more established groups maybe didn't feel the need as much.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It really shows how literature can serve practical functions, can it? Especially when formal institutions are, well, different or weaker.
Definitely. And the source adds another layer for later on, like late 13th, 14th centuries. After Iceland came under Norwegian rule, the aristocracy had this motivation to, like, reconnect with Norway and the rest of the Nordic world.
How did sagas help there?
By writing sagas that trace their family lines back to common kings and heroes shared across Scandinavia, it was a way of saying, hey, we're part of this larger aristocratic club too. It reaffirmed their status.
So the reasons for writing evolved with the politics.
Very cool.
Okay, so after all that history and theory, where can people actually find these sagas today? Are they accessible?
Oh yeah, the source confirms they're widely available. It mentions the main Icelandic edition series, Islensk Fornret, but also loads of translations into English and other languages. The National Library of Iceland apparently keeps a big bibliography if you want to track specific ones down.
Good to know. And their legacy.
Yes.
It's huge, right?
Mhm.
Still inspiring people.
Undeniable. Generations of modern artists, writers, musicians
Yeah.
across all sorts of fields.
The source lists quite a few people you definitely recognize, like J.R.R. Tolkien,
Big one.
the playwright Henry Gibson, the poet Longfellow, and many others. They directly used saga stories or themes in their own work. That really speaks to how powerful these narratives are, doesn't it?
They just keep capturing the imagination. It's true.
Okay, phew. We've really covered some ground here. We started by defining sagas, these amazing Old Norse prose stories, mostly Icelandic. Then we explored that incredible range of genres.
Kings, families, myths, knights, saints.
Right. We looked at how they were composed, moving past simple oral dictation to this idea of conscious artistic creation using different sources. And maybe the most compelling part, we dug into why medieval Iceland produced so many, linking it to that unique social and political world.
So hopefully you now have a much clearer picture of these powerful stories, the complex world they came from. It gives you real insight into this fascinating corner of literature and history.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? Here's maybe a final thought for you to chew on. If the saga seems so deeply connected to Iceland's specific political system, that decentralized commonwealth, how might different kinds of government or social structures shape the foundational stories any society tells about itself?
Good question.
And how do societies decide what counts as history, what's legend, and what's just a good story? And how do those lines blur and shift over time, just like they seem to have done with the sagas themselves? Something to keep pondering.
Okay, let's dive into something pretty extreme today. We're heading south, way south, to Antarctica.
That's right, Earth's southernmost continent. Also, the least populated, coldest, driest, and windiest. Quite the list.
It really is. And we've got this fantastic collection of sources you've shared, detailed stuff like these Wikipedia excerpts that give us a really rich picture of this place.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. So, our mission today, is to take all that information and pull out the key nuggets of knowledge for you. We'll guide you through this incredible icy world.
We're talking history, right?
Yeah.
From ancient forests to, well, ice.
Exactly. And the environment now, the extreme conditions, how they're changing, plus the life that somehow survives there, and the whole human story. Exploration, politics, science. It's complex.
It really is. I mean, some of the facts are just mind-blowing. Ancient forests, dinosaurs, hidden lakes bigger than you'd believe under kilometers of ice.
And the largest land animal being just 6 millimeters long.
Right. And this global agreement to keep it peaceful and scientific, it's unique. So where do we even start with all this?
Well, I think you have to start with just the basics, the sheer scale and where it is. Antarctica isn't just cold. It's defined by being almost entirely south of the Antarctic Circle.
Surrounded by the Southern Ocean, which really cuts it off, doesn't it?
Totally. That isolation is key. And the size.
Yeah, the size is staggering. Your sources say it's the fifth largest continent, 14.2 million square kilometers.
To give you some perspective, is about 40% bigger than Europe.
Or, get this, roughly the same surface area as Pluto. How wild is that?
It is. And most of that area, almost all of it, is buried under the Antarctic ice sheet.
That's the dominant feature, isn't it? Averaging, what, 1.9 kilometers thick?
That's the average, yeah. Just this immense dome of ice covering everything but a tiny fraction of exposed rock.
And that ice shapes the coastline, too. Nearly 18,000 kilometers long.
And it's not just a simple line on a map. Your sources break it down. About 44% is floating ice shelves, these huge extensions of the ice sheet over the ocean.
And another 38% is ice walls, where the ice is actually grounded on rock right at the coast.
Geographically, underneath all that ice, the continent's kind of split in two by the Transantarctic Mountains. You've got West Antarctica and East Antarctica.
And even though it's a frozen desert, there is water inland. It actually has a river, believe it or not.
The Onyx River, yeah. The longest one, but it only flows for a couple of months during the brief summer melt.
But the hidden water is what really gets me. Lake Vostok, right, under the Russian station.
That's the biggest subglacial lake we know of anywhere in the world. It's huge.
And the water's been locked away under, what, 4 kilometers of ice? For ages.
Well, we used to think maybe millions of years, completely sealed off. But the thinking now, based on your sources, is that the water actually gets replaced very slowly, maybe on a cycle of about 13,000 years, melting at the base, refreezing. It's dynamic.
Wow, and there are salty ones and freshwater ones down there.
Seems so, yeah. A whole hidden world of lakes beneath the ice.
Amazing. And above the ice, you've got some serious mountains. Vinson Massif is the highest peak.
Yep, 4,892 meters. Part of the Ellsworth Mountains.
And then there's Mount Erebus on Ross Island, the southernmost active volcano in the world.
It erupts pretty frequently, too. And the sources mention there's evidence for lots more volcanoes hidden under the ice sheet.
Volcanoes under kilometers of ice. What does that even do? It must have some effect.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big research question. How much geothermal heat influences the ice sheet from below?
And then there's Dome Argus. Not a mountain peak, but the highest point of the ice sheet itself.
Exactly. Over 4,000 meters high in East Antarctica. And it's documented as one of the absolute coldest, driest places on the planet.
Temperatures potentially below minus 90 Celsius? That's almost incomprehensible.
It really pushes the limits.
Yeah.
So that's the geography now. But Antarctica wasn't always like this. Its past is just as dramatic.
Right, because it used to be part of Gondwana, that supercontinent.
For hundreds of millions of years, yeah.
Yeah.
Connected to South America, Africa, India, Australia, all jammed together.
So back in the Paleozoic era, that's roughly 540 to 250 million years ago, your sources say the climate was way milder.
Yeah, tropical or temperate in parts. There were forests, marine life like trilobites in the surrounding seas. Antarctica wasn't at the pole yet.
But Gondwana drifted south later on.
It did. And there were periods of glaciation even back then. But life hung on. You had plants like Lysopteris. These trees formed huge coal deposits we still find today.
Until the big one, the end Permian extinction, that wiped out those forests.
Pretty much collapsed them, yeah. And interestingly, the sources point out we haven't found any evidence of four-legged land animals, tetrapods from Antarctica in that whole Paleozoic era.
But they definitely showed up later in the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs.
Absolutely. From 250 to 66 million years ago, Gondwana was generally warmer, maybe drier in places.
Yeah.
But you had different kinds of Floridicroidium, ferns, ginkgos, conifers.
And later flowering plants, too. West Antarctica had forests.
Coniferous forests and eventually sun beech trees, Nothofagus. It was still relatively green in places.
And dinosaurs. You mentioned Cryolophosaurus and Glacialosaurus.
Yep, from the early Jurassic, found in the Transantarctic Mountains, and then from the late Cretaceous near the end of the dinosaur era, fossils like Antarctopelta, Trinosaura, Morosaurus have turned up on the Antarctic Peninsula.
While all this was happening, Gondwana was breaking up, right?
Yeah.
Africa and India split off?
They did. The real game changer for Antarctica itself started in the Cenozoic era, after the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago.
At first, it was still connected to South America and Australia.
Yeah, forming a land bridge. Animals could migrate across marsupials, weird critters called xenarthrans, sort of like armadillos and sloths, things you'd associate with South America.
So marsupials probably got to Australia via Antarctica from South America. That's cool.
That's the prevailing theory, yeah. But the connections didn't last. Australia and New Guinea pulled away around 53 million years ago, opening the Tasmanian Passage.
But the big one was the Drake Passage opening up between Antarctica and South America.
That was the killer blow, climatically speaking, around 30 million years ago. It allowed the Antarctic circumpolar current to form.
This massive ocean current circling the entire continent.
Exactly. It completely isolated Antarctica thermally. No more warm currents reaching it from the north.
And that, plus CO2 levels dropping globally, that's what triggered the ice sheets.
That's the understanding, yes. The combination of thermal isolation and lower greenhouse gases led to rapid cooling and the massive expansion of the ice sheet, burying those ancient forests as ecosystems.
Tundra managed to survive for a while longer.
Until about 14 to 10 million years ago, according to the sources. Then it just got too cold, too dry, too harsh.
So geologically, today, West Antarctica is younger, more like the Andes. Mountains formed by plates colliding and rifting.
Yeah, geologically active, relatively speaking. Lots of volcanic activity linked to that.
Whereas East Antarctica is ancient, built on a massive, stable Precambrian shield.
Billions of years old, yeah. A really old continental core with younger layers on top, including those old sediments and the Transantarctic Mountains.
And your sources do mention resources coal from those ancient forests, iron ore, maybe oil and gas.
They've been found, tied to that geological history. But the key thing is, nothing in commercially viable quantities has been identified, especially given the challenges of extracting anything there.
Okay, let's shift to the climate now, because it really is the defining feature today. Coldest, windiest, driest.
It earns those titles for sure. It's classified as a polar desert.
The temperatures are just brutal. Coasts might get above freezing, maybe even 10 degrees C briefly in summer.
But winter coastal temperatures drop below minus 40 degrees C. And inland, on the high plateau, it's another level entirely.
Summer temps around minus 30 degrees C and winter below minus 80 degrees C.
Yeah. And the official record low, measured at Vostok Station back in '83, was minus 89.2 degrees Celsius.
Minus 89.2. And satellites have maybe detected even colder spots.
Unofficial readings down near minus 95 degrees C. It's significantly colder than the Arctic, mainly for two reasons.
Right, because Antarctica is a high-elevation continent.
Averaging over 3,000 meters in the interior. And unlike the Arctic, which is mostly frozen ocean, Antarctica is a landmass covered in ice. So there's no moderating ocean underneath the coldest parts.
And the wind just constantly blowing.
Especially those katabatic winds, cold, dense air pouring down off the high plateau towards the coast. They can be incredibly strong and persistent.
And dry. Despite all the ice, it hardly precipitates.
The average is only about 150 millimeters of water equivalent per year, mostly snow. And inland, it's much less, under 50 millimeter. Truly hyper-arid.
So how does the ice sheet even survive?
Because it's so incredibly cold. What little snow falls barely melts or sublimates. It just builds up over millennia. Although in some places like the dry valleys or blue ice areas.
The wind actually removes the snow, blowing it away or turning it straight to vapor.
Exactly, leaving bare rock or ancient, dense blue ice exposed.
And there are regional differences too, right? East Antarctica being colder.
Generally, yeah, because it's higher. Weather systems from the ocean don't tend to penetrate far inland, so the interior stays locked in that deep cold.
While at the South Pole itself, you get that 24 hours of sunlight in summer, even if it's still way below freezing.
Right. It's a land of incredible contrasts and extremes.
Okay, so that's the baseline. But the critical issue now connecting Antarctica to us is climate change.
Absolutely. Despite being so remote, it's not immune. Your sources are very clear. Human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are warming Antarctica and causing ice loss.
Especially West Antarctica and the peninsula, right? The warming there is significant.
Definitely. The peninsula has warmed around 3 degrees C since the mid-20th century, one of the fastest warming places on Earth. West Antarctica overall is warming significantly too, over 0.1 degrees C per decade.
And East Antarctica, it was thought to be more stable.
It was, but even there, warming trends have started to show up more recently in the 2000s. It's a delayed reaction, perhaps, but it seems to be happening.
And the Southern Ocean is playing a huge role, absorbing a lot of the planet's excess heat.
A massive amount, more than any other ocean basin, actually. And that warming isn't just at the surface. Your sources mention strong warming deep down below 2,000 meters. Around West Antarctica, deep water temps have gone up by 1 degree C since the 1950s.
And that warm water reaching the coast is bad news for the ice shelves.
It's terrible news. These floating ice shelves act like buttresses, holding back the glaciers on land. When warm ocean water melts them from underneath, they weaken, thin, and can eventually collapse.
And when an ice shelf goes, the glaciers behind it speed up.
Exactly. They flow faster into the ocean, contributing more to sea level rise. So even if snowfall increases slightly inland in some areas of East Antarctica, the losses at the coast, especially from West Antarctica, are outpacing any gains. The net result is ice loss.
And that directly impacts global sea levels. The projections are worrying.
Your sources suggest Antarctica's net loss could contribute about 11 centimeters to sea level rise by 2100 under current trajectories. But the big wild card is the West Antarctic ice sheet, the WAIS.
Because it's potentially unstable, sitting on bedrock below sea level.
Right. If warming triggers a runaway collapse there, it could add tens of centimeters more to sea level rise this century, potentially much faster than previously thought. High warming could even double Antarctica's total contribution by 2100.
Wow. And all that fresh water pouring into the ocean? That affects ocean currents too.
Yeah, it dilutes the very dense salty water that forms around Antarctica and sinks to the deep ocean Antarctic bottom water. This process drives a key part of the global ocean's overturning circulation.
So weakening that circulation, what does that do?
It's a slower process, likely unfolding over centuries, but the projections suggest it could change weather patterns globally, impact fisheries in the Southern Ocean, and potentially disrupt marine ecosystems quite severely.
Are we seeing biological impacts already?
Yes. Your sources mentioned documented increases in plant life, like mosses, in areas becoming ice-free on the peninsula. Penguin colonies are shifting, facing challenges finding suitable breeding grounds or food, and thawing permafrost in the few ice-free areas can release trapped greenhouse gases like methane or even old pollutants.
What about the long-term stability, that West Antarctic ice sheet?
The research highlighted in your sources suggests it's probably already committed to melting completely unless we can somehow cool the planet significantly, like 2 degrees C below 2020 levels, which seems unlikely.
And if it goes, how much sea level rise are we talking?
The melt could take a long time, 500 to 13,000 years, but it holds about 3.3 meters of potential sea level rise. Maybe 4.3 meters if other connected ice caps also go.
And the East Antarctic ice sheet, that's the monster, right?
It's huge, holding over 50 meters of sea level equivalent, generally considered much more stable due to its size and cold temperatures. Melting it entirely would take many millennia.
But parts of it are vulnerable.
Yes, certain basins like the Wilkes and Aurora basins rest below sea level, similar to West Antarctica. The sources suggest these areas could become unstable and start collapsing with around 3 degrees C of sustained global warming, potentially adding another 6.4 meters to sea level over maybe 2,000 years or so. It shows even the stable parts have tipping points.
Shifting gears slightly, but still environmental, the ozone hole. That was an Antarctic discovery, wasn't it?
Famously so, yeah. Discovered above Halley Station in 1985, it was linked directly to CFCs and halons chemicals we were releasing, reacting in the unique conditions of the Antarctic stratosphere.
Those polar stratospheric clouds, right? Forming in the extreme cold.
Exactly. They provide surfaces for the chemical reactions that destroy ozone. The hole reached its largest size in 2006 and lasted longest in 2020.
But the Montreal Protocol, the international agreement to ban those chemicals, is working.
It is. It's one of the big environmental success stories. Your sources say the ozone layer is slowly recovering, with full recovery expected sometime in the 2060s.
What's fascinating is the link between the ozone hole and the climate down there.
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive. The ozone depletion actually cooled the stratosphere significantly by about 6 degrees C.
And that strengthened the polar vortex, the winds circling the continent.
Right, which effectively trapped the cold air even more efficiently over East Antarctica, likely contributing to the lack of warming there for a while. But at the same time, it seems to have drawn warmer air towards the periphery, like the peninsula, potentially accelerating melting there.
So the ozone hole might have ironically slowed warming in the interior, but sped it up on the edges.
That's the thinking. It might even explain why Antarctic sea ice increased overall from the late 70s until about 2014, bucking the global trend before it started decreasing rapidly. It shows these complex interactions between different parts of the Earth system.
Okay, so we have this incredibly harsh, changing environment. What about life? How does anything actually live there?
It's sparse, especially on land, but surprisingly resilient. A lot of the species there are thought to be descendants of life that survived past ice ages in tiny refuges, maybe near geothermal vents or on mountain peaks that stuck out above the ice.
And the land animals are mostly tiny invertebrates?
Yeah, microscopic things mainly. Mites, lice, flea-specific Antarctic kinds, mind you, nematodes, tardigrades, those amazing water bears that can survive almost anything. Springtails, too.
And the biggest purely terrestrial animal? That flightless midge, Belgica antarctica.
6 millimeters long, that's it. Everything else native to the land is smaller. If it lives on land year-round, it's tiny.
But in the ocean, it's a different story, starting with krill.
Antarctic krill are the absolute linchpin of the Southern Ocean ecosystem, billions of them. They're the food base for almost everything larger.
Whales, seals, penguins.
Blue whales, humpbacks, orcas, leopard seals, crab-eater seals, Weddell seals, emperor penguins, Adelie penguins. The list goes on. Colossal squid, too.
Emperor penguins are amazing, breeding in the middle of winter. Adelies go the furthest south. And seals, fur seals, were nearly wiped out by hunting.
Hunted relentlessly in the 18th and 19th centuries. They've recovered somewhat, but not to original numbers. Leopard seals are the top predators. Pretty fearsome.
And birds, besides penguins.
About 40 species breed there, mostly seabirds like petrels, albatrosses, skuas, cormorants, gulls, and many others migrate there seasonally, some traveling huge distances.
Didn't your sources mention birds coming all the way from the Arctic?
Some do, yeah. Arctic terns make that incredible pole-to-pole migration.
And that finding from the Census of Marine Life? Organisms living at both poles.
Over 235 species. It blew researchers away. Things like sea cucumbers, snails. Somehow crossing the entire tropics, maybe through deep, cold currents carrying eggs or larvae over generations. It shows life finds a way.
What about fungi? You wouldn't necessarily think of them.
But there are loads. Around 1,150 species identified. Many live inside porous rocks in the dry valleys, escaping the worst of the conditions.
How do they survive?
Incredible adaptations mentioned in the sources. Simplified structures, metabolisms that work at super low temperatures, short life cycles, thick, dark cell walls to resist UV radiation.
And some are used in astrobiology research because they're so tough.
Exactly. Species like Boelia frigida or Cryomyces antarcticus, which survived simulated Mars conditions in space experiments. Their survival strategies might give clues about what potential life on Mars or other cold planets could look like.
There are even fungi adapted to live in bird dung, surviving freezing and digestive tracts.
Talk about specialization. Nature is endlessly inventive.
Plant life is much tougher, though.
Very limited. The freezing temperatures, lack of soil, moisture, and sunlight for much of the year, it's incredibly restrictive. Mostly just mosses, liverworts, lichens, the really hardy stuff.
Only 3 flowering plants survive there.
That's right. 2 natives, Antarctic hairgrass and Antarctic pearlworts, and 1 non-native annual bluegrass, which probably arrived with humans. And they only grow in the mildest part, the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula.
What about algae?
Loads of algae. About 700 species. Phytoplankton are the base of the ocean food web. And in summer, on the snow near the coasts, you get snow algae that can bloom in amazing colors, red, green, yellow.
And life in the sea ice.
Yeah, tiny brine channels within the ice host, whole communities of microbes that can go dormant in winter and revive when things warm up slightly.
And even under the ice chute, bacteria found 800 meters down.
Incredible discovery. And the unique bacterial communities found in subglacial lakes like Vostok and Lake Undersea. They really fuel speculation about life beyond Earth.
Lake Vostok supporting the idea of life on Europa.
Because Europa likely has a salty ocean under its ice crust, similar in some ways. And Lake Undersea's extremophiles living in alkaline, methane-rich water suggest life might exist in other kinds of weird, cold environments out there.
It really shifts your perspective on where life might be possible. Which brings us neatly to the human story in Antarctica.
The story that starts with myth, really. The idea of Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land.
Ancient Greeks theorized it had to exist to balance the northern continents.
Right. But it took centuries to find. Captain James Cook was the first to definitively cross the Antarctic Circle in the 1770s. He got incredibly close to the continent multiple times.
But never actually saw land, did he? Just ice. He suspected a continent was there, but thought it was inaccessible and useless.
The first confirmed sightings came later, clustered around 1820. A Russian expedition led by Bellingshausen saw an ice shelf. Days later, a British naval officer, Edward Bransfield, sighted the peninsula.
And maybe an American sealer, Nathaniel Palmer, around the same time?
Possibly, yeah. The records are a bit ambiguous. Sealers were definitely active down there early on, pushing into unknown waters. Human remains from sealers dating back to 1819, 1825 have been found.
The first actual landing on the continent itself? That's debated, too.
An American sealer, John Davis, claimed a brief landing in 1821, but it's not universally accepted. The first confirmed landing on the mainland was by a Norwegian whaling group at Cape Adare in 1895.
Before that, expeditions like the French in 1840 landed on islands and claimed a daily land, and James Clark Ross explored the Ross Sea area extensively in 1841.
Then came the heroic age in the early 20th century, Shackleton's Nimrod expedition.
Getting close to the South Pole, reaching the magnetic pole, crossing the mountains. Incredible journeys.
Absolutely harrowing stuff. And then the race for the geographic South Pole itself.
Amundsen versus Scott.
Roald Amundsen's Norwegian team got there first, December 1911. Robert Falcon Scott's British team arrived about a month later, tragically dying on the return journey.
Later on, people like Richard Byrd really opened up the continent using aircraft and tractors in the 20s, 30s, 40s.
Surveying huge areas, proving it was indeed a continent. And women started making their mark, too. Ingrid Christensen, first woman on the mainland in 1937.
And the pole was finally reached by aircraft in 1956. Then came overland traverses.
And incredible solo journeys, like Burj Oslin's coast-to-coast kiteski crossing in the 90s. Just phenomenal endurance.
So who lives there now? It's the least populated continent.
By far. No permanent residents in the traditional sense. The population is almost entirely scientists and support staff at research stations.
Numbers fluctuate hugely, right? Maybe 1,200 in winter, nearly 5,000 in summer.
Something like that, yeah. Plus, a couple of civilian settlements run by Argentina and Chile, mostly families of personnel stationed there. Historically, there were semi-permanent whaling communities on islands like South Georgia.
And the first babies born down there?
First in the whole Antarctic region was a Norwegian girl on South Georgia in 1913. First on the actual mainland was an Argentine boy, Emilio Palma, at Esperanza Base in 1978 that made quite a political statement at the time.
Which brings us to the politics. How is this place even governed?
Through a pretty unique international agreement, the Antarctic Treaty System. The main treaty was signed in 1959, coming out of the cooperative spirit of the International Geophysical Year.
Originally 12 countries, including the big players active then.
Yes, the U.S., Soviet Union, now Russia, UK, plus the 7 countries with territorial claims, and others involved in research. Now there are over 50 parties, but the key decisions are made by the consultative parties.
Those are the countries doing significant research there, currently 29 of them.
That's right, and they operate by consensus, which is crucial. Everyone has to agree.
And what does the treaty actually do?
Fundamentally, it sets Antarctica aside as a place for peace and science. Military activity is banned. Nuclear explosions and waste disposal are banned. It guarantees freedom of scientific investigation and promotes international cooperation.
But what about those territorial claims? 7 countries claim wedges of the continent.
The treaty didn't resolve them. It basically put them on hold. It states that nothing in the treaty prejudices existing claims, but also that no new claims can be made while the treaty is in force. And importantly, it ensures that activities undertaken under the treaty don't constitute a basis for asserting or denying a claim.
So the claims still exist on paper, but they don't really affect the scientific cooperation.
Largely, yes. Though sometimes tensions flare up. Your sources mention the UK naming Queen Elizabeth Land in 2012, which overlaps claims by Argentina and Chile and Argentina protesting.
And some claims overlap anyway, like the UK, Argentina, and Chile all claiming parts of the peninsula. Others don't overlap and are sort of mutually recognized amongst those claimants.
Right. Britain, Australia, New Zealand, France, Norway have non-overlapping claims they recognize among themselves. Other countries like Russia and the U.S. reserve the right to make claims in the future. And there's still one big slice, Murray Bird Land, that nobody claims.
It's a fascinating political compromise. What about the economy? Is there one?
Not really in terms of resource extraction. As we said, minerals exist but aren't economically viable. And crucially, the Madrid Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty, which came into force in 1998, bans all mining and mineral resource activities indefinitely, unless modified by consensus.
That protocol is up for review in 2048.
Yes, but changing the mining ban would require a very high bar, a consensus decision. So the main economic activity right now is actually tourism.
That started back in the 50s.
Yeah, small scale at first, but it's grown hugely. Now regulated by the treaty system and the industry itself through IATO, the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators.
Mostly ship-based tourism visiting coastal sites. Over 74,000 visitors in the season before the pandemic.
That's the kind of number, yeah. It raises concerns about environmental impacts, disturbance to wildlife, pollution risk, introduction of non-native species. So there are strict guidelines about where ships can go, how many people can land at once, behavior around animals.
Many tours focus on being ecologically responsible.
Increasingly so, yes. Wildlife viewing and appreciating the unique landscape are the main draws. There were also scenic overflights for a while.
Until that terrible Air New Zealand crash on Mount Erebus in 1979.
Right, they stopped for years after that, though some limited flights have resumed since the 90s.
So if not resource extraction or mass tourism, the main human activity is research.
Absolutely. It's a continent dedicated to science. There are over 70 research stations run by about 30 different countries, year-round and seasonal.
Like McMurdo, the big U.S. station.
Oh!
Or the carbon-neutral Belgian one.
McMurdo is like a small town in summer.
Hmm.
Princess Elizabeth Antarctica Station in Belgium is a showcase for sustainable technology. Lots of countries have significant bases: Argentina, Australia, Chile, China, Russia, UK, Germany, France, Japan.
And what kind of science are they doing?
Everything imaginable, really. Geology, understanding Gondwana's breakup, plate tectonics. Glaciology, studying how the ice sheets move, melt, and respond to climate change. Biology, how life survives in extremes, the marine ecosystem, human impacts.
Biomedical research, too, how people cope with the isolation and cold.
Yes, studying immune responses, psychology. And astrophysics, the clear, stable, dry air over the high plateau is perfect for observing the cosmos. Looking for cosmic microwave background radiation, detecting neutrinos.
That ice cube detector at the South Pole, using a cubic kilometer of ice.
Incredible engineering. And Antarctica is the best place in the world to find meteorites. They land everywhere, but on the ice sheet, they're preserved and concentrated in certain areas, make them easy to spot.
Including ones from the Moon and Mars, like that ALH 85401 meteorite that sparked debate about Martian life.
Exactly. It's a treasure trove for planetary science.
And the big focus now in research strategy, according to your sources, is climate change.
Definitely. Major programs like the British Antarctic Survey, the U.S. Antarctic Program, the Australians, they're heavily focused on understanding ice sheet stability, the Southern Ocean's role, and predicting future sea level rise. Projects like INSTANT and IceCap are using cutting-edge tech to map the ice and bedrock below, and focusing on sustainability in their own operations too.
Finally, is there an Antarctic culture?
In a way, yeah, among the people who spend time there. Your sources mention things like Ice Stock, a music festival at McMurdo, an Antarctic film festival, sporting events like marathons, believe it or not.
A marathon in Antarctica.
Wow, they even play football sometimes. And there are unique traditions and holidays like Midwinter Day, a big celebration during the darkest part of the year, and Antarctica Day on December 1st, marking the treaty signing. It's a shared experience that bonds the diverse international community there.
So when we pull it all together, it's just this incredible place. Ancient history, frozen in time, the most extreme conditions on Earth, life clinging on in amazing ways.
And this unique layer of human interaction, exploration, science, and this attempt at peaceful international governance in a place with no native population and contested territory.
It really is a continent of superlatives, holding vital clues about our planet's past, its present climate crisis, and its future. And maybe clues about life elsewhere, too.
Definitely. Thinking about those discoveries, the microbes deep under the ice, the complex ecosystems in those hidden lakes that have been cut off for millennia.
It just fires the imagination, doesn't it? Given that life has found these niches, these ways to persist in such utterly extreme, dark, cold, high-pressure environments right here on Earth.
What does that really suggest to you about the potential for maybe finding similar footholds elsewhere? In those subsurface oceans we think exist on moons like Europa or Enceladus, or maybe deep beneath the surface of Mars, protected from the harsh conditions we see today.